Initiating flexible development, this knight prepares for rapid central influence and potential queenside expansion. Mirroring white's knight development, this response immediately contests central squares and preserves flexible pawn structure. Opening up lines for the queen and bishop, white immediately stakes a claim for central space. Embracing the fianchetto allows black to activate their bishop and prepare for kingside castling, creating a solid defensive setup. Solidifying the kingside and preparing for a fianchetto, this move subtly prepares for queenside expansion or a central pawn push later. Developing the bishop to this diagonal opens lines for its power and sets the stage for central control. Solidifying control of the central dark squares and preparing for kingside castling, this piece development harmonizes beautifully with the pawn structure. Securing the monarch is paramount. This prudent maneuver shelters the king behind a nascent pawn shield and prepares for piece development. Asserting central control with pawns initiates a thematic battle for space, preparing to unleash bishops. Solidifying the center and preparing for a pawn break, this move fosters harmonious development while reinforcing black's central influence. Solidifying the center and preparing for pawn advances secures white's space and initiative. Challenging the center, black injects immediate dynamism, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and seize more central space. Developing the knight reinforces the queenside pawn structure and prepares to contest central control. Solidifying the center and preparing counterplay, this knight secures crucial central squares. Instantly solidifying central space, this thrust aims to restrict black's piece development and create a clear pawn majority on the queenside for later exploitation. That knight's sortie to the rim surprisingly aims to disrupt white's central pawn chain, creating an outpost for itself. Repositioning the knight to a more flexible square prepares for pawn advances and potentially a kingside attack, while also defending the c4 pawn. Opening the center strategically, black challenges white's d-pawn and aims for active piece play despite the slightly cramped position. Solidifying the central pawn chain, this gambit of space aims to restrict black's queenside mobility. Unleashing the knight to g4 immediately challenges the center's control and opens lines of attack towards white's kingside, creating dynamic possibilities. Challenging black's aggressive knight with a pawn thrust, forcing a decision and potentially creating attacking chances on the kingside. Retreating the knight to the rim offers little active participation and surrenders central influence. Expanding control on the queenside, this pawn push prepares to fianchetto the light-squared bishop and fortify the queenside structure. Unleashing the f-pawn creates immediate tension and aims to disrupt white's central control, potentially opening lines for attack. Unlocking the kingside, white liberates the pawn chain and opens avenues for development with this capture. Opening the kingside for your knight to exploit, though it weakens your pawn structure significantly. Asserting dominance on the queen side, this bishop I-bolts the d6 pawn and shores up the b3 pawn. Developing the bishop to d7 prepares for a potential queenside expansion and centralizes a key piece for future action. Unifying the queenside pawns and preparing pressure on the kingside is the intent here. Solidifying the queenside structure establishes a strong defensive pawn chain, preparing for potential counterplay. Steering the knight towards the queenside offers more influence, preparing a central push while bolstering king safety. Challenging the center's pawn chain, this queen repositions for a queenside counterplay. Unleashing the f-pawn injects immediate tension, aiming to pry open the kingside while black's knights scramble. Reinforcing the e-file is crucial, but the kingside dark squares now look somewhat vulnerable. Mobilizing the rook to the central file signals a potent readiness to challenge black's pawn structure and claim initiative along the rank. Introducing the knight to the queenside, this maneuver prepares for potential queenside expansion and supports the d6 pawn. Rerouting the knight to a more active square, potentially targeting the kingside or reinforcing the d4 pawn. A strategic repositioning, aiming to activate the bishop along the long diagonal and challenge white's central dominance. Asserting central space becomes paramount. This bishop redeploys to activate its diagonal, aiming to exploit the kingside pawn weaknesses. Capturing the pawn immediately sparks a tactical storm, challenging white's central control and opening lines for counterplay. Reopening the g-file creates immediate attacking possibilities against the kingside, but it also exposes white's own king. Initiating a tactical skirmish on the light squares, black seeks to disrupt white's central pawn structure, though it might weaken their own king's protection. Securing the central queen and opening a diagonal for her active participation is a tactical necessity given the pawn structure. The black queen aggressively centralizes, seeking dynamic play and threatening white's king. Sacrificing the queen on g7 initiates an endgame where white aims to exploit black's exposed king and potential piece activity. Unburdening the king from the pawn shield opens up new attacking avenues, but also exposes it to future threats. Unifying the bishops finally unleashes pressure along the c-file, aiming to dismantle black's weakened kingside. A bold repositioning, the knight seeks more active squares, preparing to challenge the centralized white pieces. Repositioning the knight to a more active square prepares for a central pawn push or a kingside assault. This maneuver aims to reposition the knight for better central influence and potential threats along the c-file, though it temporarily concedes important dark squares. Reactivating the king to a more active central square is a prudent step towards improving its defensive posture and preparing for potential endgame scenarios. Reawakening the knight from its passive slumber aims to challenge the central control and open new avenues for attack. Repositioning the rook to the g-file aims to exert pressure along that open corridor, potentially targeting black's weakened kingside. Recentralizing the king after the exchange offers flexibility and prepares for potential king advances into white's weakened kingside. Reactivating the knight's central influence, preparing for a potential kingside advance and reinforcing the weakened e-file. Bringing the bishop to the active diagonal clears a path for the rook and bolsters the kingside defense. Reasserting central influence, the knight prepares to join the battle on the kingside, aiming for better squares than its counterpart. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside to challenge white's central control and open attacking lines. Targeting the king's shadow with this knight sortie opens lines for the rook to join the assault. Gathering the king from its exposed square, this repositioning seeks refuge while maintaining defensive ties to the weakened queenside pawns. Centralizing the knight offers greater flexibility for attacking white's weakened kingside. Accepting the exchange simplifies the position, opening the e-file for potential piece activity while avoiding a cramped situation. Reclaiming the central file after the exchange streamlines pressure on black's exposed king. Reactivating the knight from its passive post aims to contest the open g-file and avoid getting squeezed. Reclaiming the light-squared bishop's influence on the kingside, a subtle repositioning to improve defense. The knight's retreat aims to redeploy and challenge white's central control, seeking active squares to support the kingside. Re-establishing central influence and preparing for potential pawn pushes, this knight repositions to bolster white's kingside and challenge black's entrenched pieces. Suddenly, exchanging knights offers a promising breakthrough, aiming to disrupt white's unified pawn structure. A king's journey begins, venturing into the fray to reclaim central influence and challenge black's nascent initiative. Introducing the rook to the open g-file is a strategic priority, aiming to leverage the remaining material advantage. Seeking to activate the rook and pressure the g-file, aiming to exploit the current pawn structure and create attacking chances against the black king. Relocating the king to the center offers better protection from white's advancing pieces and prepares for potential pawn pushes. Reactivating the knight to control central squares and prepare for kingside expansion offers a fresh dynamic. Shifting the rook to the f-file aims to create counterplay against white's king by leveraging the open lines. Assessing the pawn structure, this advances a flank pawn, creating potential space and a new target. The knight's repositioning aims to challenge the newly opened king's file, potentially disrupting white's rook activity and creating tactical skirmishes. Pushing the b-pawn aims to shatter the queenside pawn structure and open lines for your rook. Shifting the knight to the queenside opens lines for potential infiltration, but the king remains somewhat exposed. Expanding on the queenside creates immediate friction and challenges black's rook positioning. Repositioning the knight to the kingside opens potential breakthroughs. Opening the queenside flank with a pawn push seeks to generate queenside play and disrupt black's unified pawn structure. Navigating the cramped space, black redirects the knight to better squares, aiming to escape the current defensive posture. Opening the queenside flank further aims to disrupt black's defensive structure. Opening the queenside pawn chain after the capture allows for counterplay along the semi-open b-file. The rook's advance to the open file aims to challenge black's pawn structure and create potential attacking pathways. The knight sprints towards the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn majority by attacking the isolated pawn. Targeting the backward c-pawn, this rook lift aims to penetrate the queenside and exploit any structural weaknesses. The king's journey toward the center begins, seeking active participation in the upcoming endgame. Securing the rook to control the open file offers a stable foundation for future maneuvers. Shifting the king to safety begins a crucial endgame maneuver. Opening the g-file offers black some counterplay, but this rook move aims to improve white's defensive structure. Shifting the king away from the queenside pawn storm opens lines for potential counterplay. Reorganizing the rook to the kingside, seeking better defensive coordination and potential counterplay. Shifting the rook to a more active file offers potential for coordination with the remaining pieces. Ramping up pressure on the queenside, the rook invades to exploit any weaknesses. Preparing to launch an offensive thrust with the king, aiming to awaken the slumbering pieces. Initiating a crucial repositioning to activate the knight on the kingside. The knight repositions, aiming to bolster the central pawns and potentially support a kingside sortie. Reclaiming central influence with the knight to prepare for pawn advances on the queenside. This king's advance begins a risky central dash, seeking an active role in the endgame. Reactivating the king's central presence aims to connect white's forces for the coming middle game skirmishes. A cautious repositioning of the king, seeking safety from potential tactical threats on the kingside. Re-establishing knight presence in the center aims to disrupt black's passive coordination and prepare for pawn advances. Shifting the rook to the 6th rank prepares for a strategic fight for the g-file, aiming to pressure white's king. Recentralizing the knight to control key squares is a shrewd repositioning for future attacks. The king tucks into safety, a necessary precaution given the active rook and passed pawn. Unleashing the knight to its prime outpost on g5 is a dynamic shift, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure and threaten its vulnerable king. Initiating a desperate pawn thrust exposes the king's precarious flank, inviting further king attacks. Reasserting pressure on the f-file is the objective here, aiming to exploit any weakness around black's monarch. The rook's redeployment opens lines for the king to become more active in the pawn-cluttered center. Reactivating the knight to control central squares and prepare for a pawn advance on the kingside. The king's journey from the center to a more defensive posture begins now. Recentralizing the knight aims to improve its scope and prepare for a potential pawn advance on the kingside. Black's king is becoming increasingly exposed as white aims to penetrate the kingside. Reasserting control of the open files is key as the game heads toward a potential endgame skirmish. Seeking to improve the king's mobility and prepare for potential pawn breaks. The rook vacates the 1st rank, preparing for a potential advance that might threaten black's king or create new attacking avenues. Recentralizing the king is crucial now as the queens are off, and the game simplifies towards rook play. Shifting the knight to b3 aims to establish better defensive coverage for the kingside pawn structure. Repositioning the king now, seeking a safer haven from the potential pawn storm brewing on the queen side. Relocating the rook to the open file aims to improve its posting and potentially support an advance on the king side. The black king bravely ventures towards the queen side, seeking new outposts and potential counterplay. Reactivating the knight on d2 aims to regain central influence and potentially contest the d-file, a critical path for both sides. Shifting the knight to the queen side intends to challenge white's advanced pawns and activate the piece. Reorganizing knight seeks to solidify the central structure and prepare for potential pawn advances. The bishop finally finds a more active diagonal, aiming to support the rook's infiltration. Securing the open file prevents black's rook from dominating the rank. The knight's retreat to b8 seems to abandon the queen side's defensive structure. Repositioning the knight to g3 aims to prepare a kingside pawn advance, potentially opening lines towards black's king. Reactivating the king and centralizing the rook offer new attacking avenues. Stepping back with the knight allows the king to reposition, seeking safer squares away from the open files. Repositioning the rook to the center aims to consolidate the position and prepare for a potential breakthrough on the king side. Reactivating the queenside knight aims to support a pawn push or contest the open files. This quiet maneuver aims to bolster the king's defense while preparing to potentially challenge the e-file. Probing for weaknesses on the queen side, this knight transfer aims to destabilize black's pawn structure and potentially target the now exposed c-file. Opening the queen side further for potential infiltration, though it might leave the knight exposed. Opening a pathway for the rook to infiltrate the queen side is a key objective now. Seeking to activate the rook by bringing it to the file to pressure white's pawns. Repositioning the rook to the 6th rank aims to restrict the black king's activity and prepare a decisive pawn push. Securing the 7th rank becomes paramount for counterplay against white's encroaching rook. Repositioning the knight to flank the black rook and prepare a potential advance on the king side. Seeking respite from the encroaching knights and the isolated rook, black's king attempts to find safer havens behind the pawn shield. Reigniting the attack, the knight embarks on a daring journey towards the king side. Aimed at seizing the now open c-file, this knight repositions for pressure, potentially disrupting white's central stability and creating counterplay. A vigilant repositioning of the rook, aiming to control the crucial 7th rank and prepare for a potential breakthrough on the king side. The rook retreats, aiming to solidify its defense on the 7th rank and prepare for a potential regrouping. Reasserting central influence, the knight repositions to reinforce the king's safety and prepare for potential queenside pressure. Repositioning the rook to the 7th rank looks to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create mating threats. Re-establishing open files for piece activity becomes paramount as the endgame looms. Reactivating the bishop to support the pawn structure and potentially target white's kingside. Reactivating the b-file offers a fresh attacking pathway against black's potentially isolated king. Reactivating the dark-squared bishop from its defensive post on the c8 h3 diagonal opens new possibilities. Initiating the knight's repositioning to potentially exploit the kingside by hopping to f3, then perhaps g5. Focusing on maneuvering the king to a safer haven, away from the open files, seems like a prudent step for black. Shifting the rook to the central file offers flexibility and supports pawn advances. Relocating the king to the center after so much maneuvering is a bold gambit, hoping to capitalize on potential overextension. Reactivating the rook to the kingside offers fresh attacking perspectives. Re-establishing central kingside presence is paramount. The monarch desperately needs a safer haven than the exposed central files. Repositioning the knight to g3 aims to finally activate it and potentially pressure black's kingside or center. The king retreats to the d8 square, seeking refuge and perhaps preparing for a later sortie on the dark squares, though its current safety feels precarious. Awaiting King's active re-entry into the central theater is key to unlocking this position's potential. The king is once again being repositioned, seeking a safer haven amidst the slowly evolving pawn structure. Pioneering a pawn thrust to unlock King's safety concerns. The king continues its slow journey towards the queen side, seeking shelter from potential checks and aiming to become active. Probing the kingside pawn structure opens new avenues for the white rook. The king seeks refuge on the queen side, attempting to evade further pawn advances and central threats. Pushing the king forward looks to secure space and prepare for potential pawn advances, but it also opens new lines of attack for black. The black king cautiously retreats to the center, seeking safety amidst the swirling pawns and rook activity. Repositioning the rook to create a new defensive perimeter and prepare for potential pawn advances. Relocating the king to the center offers more defensive options and prepares for potential pawn breakthroughs. Unlocking the b-file opens a new avenue for the rook, threatening to disrupt black's kingside structure and potentially create a passed pawn. Opening the queenside can be a risky gamble when your king is so exposed. The pawn structure may crumble. The pawn's march to promotion creates immediate pressure, forcing a crucial decision for black's king and pieces. Sacrificing the rook to disrupt white's pawn avalanche and seize the initiative. The rook is finally activated, seizing the initiative and threatening to control the critical queenside majority. The king's perilous journey across the board continues, now seeking refuge from the imminent rook's advance. Unleashing the rook's power now on the 8th rank forces a difficult decision for black's king. Finally, black concedes control of the c-file, allowing white's rook to dominate the board and pressure black's remaining pieces. Seeking to centralize the monarch, white bravely advances the king into the fray. The black king cautiously retreats, seeking refuge as the pawns on the queenside advance. Initiating the final march of the monarch to secure the pawn majority and prepare for further advances. Reactivating the bishop to potentially disrupt white's pawn structure and create counterplay. Challenging the passed pawn's advance is paramount, preventing it from becoming an unstoppable force. Sensing an endgame shift, black prepares to contest the vital c-file for the pawn structure's integrity. Asserting control over the 7th rank to pressure black's isolated pawns. Protecting the king's escape square is paramount before the rook can potentially get more active. Probing the kingside defenses, the knight prepares to reinforce the central pawn structure or potentially swing over to attack. The king seeks sanctuary on the back rank, a common instinct when facing overwhelming pawn structures. Preparing a swift knight maneuver to the kingside, aiming to pressure black's weakened pawn structure. A patient repositioning of the rook to challenge white's central pawn push, aiming to disrupt its advance. Seizing the open file offers attacking potential, pressing black's queenside weaknesses. The rooks are now poised to dance around each other, preparing for a potential endgame skirmish. Unleashing the knight to a more active square, eyeing potential breakthroughs and reinforcing the central advance. The rook's maneuver to the center opens up critical central files, creating potential play and pressure on white's kingside. Sacrificing the rook here is a desperate attempt to force a stalemate by limiting the black king's escape, a bold gamble against a superior position. The rook's repositioning allows it to defend the king from the queen's pressure. Activating the king with tempo to avoid immediate pawn-pawn exchanges becomes paramount. This vigilant rook repositions to safeguard the king, reinforcing the defensive network. Seizing the initiative, the knight pivots to a more active square, aiming to pressure black's advanced pawns. The bishop seeks to reposition, aiming to contest the central files once the rook exchanges are completed. Asserting control over the central files becomes paramount now, especially with the kings so exposed. The knight repositions for a potential pawn push or rook activation. Preparing to exploit the open kingside by advancing the rook and restricting black's piece mobility. The bishop now retreats to a safer square, giving the king a bit more breathing room while eyeing the d-file. Initiating a coordinated attack on the queen side, aiming to exploit black's passive king. Unlocking the bishop's diagonal opens up a path for potential harassment of the white king. The knight's foray forces the king into a precarious position, opening avenues for the white rooks. A desperate attempt to break free from the suffocating encirclement, but it might leave the king exposed. The rook's aggressive check forces black's king into a precarious position, opening lines for a decisive attack. The black king is increasingly exposed with this centralized maneuver, inviting aggressive eye contact from the white rook. The king is forced from its precarious post, surrendering its pawn shelter. Initiating a critical retreat under pressure, aiming to consolidate forces before the storm. Unleashing the knight towards the critical g-file adds pressure to black's king. The rook's relocation to the open file sets up a potential raid, aiming to infiltrate white's weakened king defenses. Unleashing the king into the fray is a bold maneuver, aiming to seize central space before the opponent solidifies their position. Reclaiming the rook to a more active file, eyeing potential breakthroughs on the king side. The king ventures out, aiming to reignite the attack and challenge black's defensive posture. Retreating the rook to safety allows black to solidify their defenses and prepare for potential counterplay in the center. The rook's advance forces the king into a precarious corner, setting the stage for a swift conclusion. The king's exodus towards the center now faces a stark reality of open files and potential checks. Securing the g5 pawn frees up the knight to a more active diagonal. Sacrificing the bishop to activate the king offers dynamic play, but it exposes the monarch to immediate dangers. Suddenly, a knight enters the fray, threatening to disrupt black's already precarious pawn structure. The rook now claims the open file, aiming to liberate the bishop trapped on the queen side. Forcing the king into a vulnerable square to disrupt black's defensive setup. The king, now exposed on the open file, desperately seeks refuge as the rooks prepare to hunt. Suddenly, the knight initiates a dangerous raid into enemy territory, seeking opportunities to disrupt black's defenses. A desperate check aiming to disrupt white's advancing king and potentially create counterplay. Unleashing the king into the fray at last, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares. The checking king is suddenly exposed, creating a dangerous counterplay opportunity. Escorting the king back into the fray with tempo, seeking to disrupt black's defensive consolidation. The king is still too exposed. A better retreat would secure it from further threats. Aimed directly at the unsuspecting rook, this knight maneuver seeks to exploit the overextended black position.